I'm Garrick Francis. This is the Inheritance to Income podcast, where we help families, founders, and leaders move from legacy by default to legacy by design. If you're building something for the next generation and don't know what comes next, you're in the right place. I'm your legacy advocate. Let's talk about it. Today, it's my great pleasure to welcome to the podcast Shakisha Morgan, the legacy counselor. We've had a lot of conversations about legacy and about heirs and about a number of things. And I know you have a broad practice where you help people with legacy, with estates, with business, with planning in general.
Mhm.
But I know one of the areas of great interest is what's called heirs property. So, and not AIRS,
Yes.
HEIRS.
HEIR.
So, what is heirs property?
All right. So, it's so funny because I always have to correct people on the spelling. So to make sure that they're in the same mind as me. So let's break it down. Heir means someone who is entitled to inherit from you. Right? So I have two kids. My two kids are my heirs. In some jurisdictions, your spouse can inherit from you. So your spouse can also be your heir. Let's think about property. My teacher had, my professor had is on here. Let's think about property as a piece of pie. So we have a whole pie, and that is a piece of property. The pie does not get bigger. It's just that one pie. So somebody bought that pie. They bought that piece of property, and they died. And when they died, let's say they had two heirs. Now, those two heirs, if they did nothing, are entitled to 50% of that property. The problem is what some people do, what happens in a lot of places that because of limited education about like the mechanisms and the administrative requirements to pass property down using a deed of some sort, people don't legally pass property down. This has been, this has been researched over and over as it relates to rural areas. My area of research is how this affects urban areas. So people like my family in Prince George's County, people like my friends' families in Washington D.C. And so what happens is you have this pie, and those two heirs get each half of the pie. And they don't really get it; they get their entitlement
Mm.
to that half of the pie. But then those two pass, and each of them have two. So now instead of everybody getting 100% down to everybody being entitled to 50%, everybody's entitled to 25%.
Mm.
But the pie doesn't get any bigger. What each person gets from the pie gets smaller and smaller and smaller with each generation. The problem that people run into is that they may live in the house, they may pay taxes related to the house. They may farm the land that is the property that's being owned. But because the property hasn't been legally passed down, they're entitled to the share of it, but they never actually become the owner of their portion of it. So they're limited in their decision making. They're limited in relief that they can get, right? If you think about Hurricane Katrina, what a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people ran into was that because of the air property, when the government was now handing out assistance, you had to show that you were an owner to get assistance for a particular piece of property. So if you were in something called air property, meaning you were living in it, you were entitled to it because it was your mama's house or
Mm-hmm.
grandma's house, but you weren't the legal owner, you couldn't apply for that kind of aid. So it is something that my research has just shown that, especially for Black people, when we come and we are using home ownership as a wonderful impactful way to grow wealth because of our limited use of the legal mechanisms that allow us to build that wealth in a way that goes from generation to generation. We're stopped
Mm.
and limited in what we can actually do because we don't legally own the property. So that's heirs property.
Right. So if you're okay, I think I understand. So if you're living in a house that, let's say, um, you grew up in a house
Mm-hmm.
and it was your grandmama's house,
Mm-hmm.
and before that it was her dad's house,
Mm-hmm.
and so your family's been in this house for 90, 100 years. How do you find out? Because some people would think, oh well, and is it different jurisdiction by jurisdiction, or property? In North Carolina, they quote unquote property falls to the
Mm-hmm.
heir, or what? How do you know? How do you find out?
Usually, the way that people find out, they find out because they've gone to an attorney to do something with the property and they look up the deed and that person's name is not on the deed.
Mm.
Or they go to file for assistance as it relates to something and they can't because they're not the legal owner. Or they get a notice as it relates to something related to the property, either a foreclosure or a tax sale, or someone who came in through
Mm.
one of the heirs, bought up one of the small
Wow.
pieces, and then is now selling the whole pie. That's typically how people find out. So people can go multiple generations and never realize that they are sitting in, using, living in property that they don't legally own.
Wow. But wait a minute. Wait a minute. You said something that caught my attention. You said if you explain that, okay, well, if a piece of property is split in two and then it's split again in two more,
Mhm,
so my math is not as good. Two
mhm,
times two,
mhm,
two
mhm.
times four,
It's
so it's
it's split in
eight.
small
So
pieces.
it's small pieces,
Yeah.
but those are equal pieces.
Yes.
But you said somebody comes in and forces a sale, so the
Mhm.
power dynamic doesn't seem equal.
So heirs property, the form of ownership is called like your tenants in common, meaning everybody. The reason why it just keeps getting smaller and smaller because your piece is an undivided piece. So it just it sticks with you and goes
Mm-hmm.
down through you, right? What predatory buyers will do is they will come and the law allows them to pick off one of the heirs. So let's say one heir owns 1% of the property. They'll buy the 1%, and then what they'll do is because now they are an owner, and any owner can file for what we call a partition, which could force the sale of the entire piece. Someone could come in at 1% because the 1% person is like some distant cousin living out, in some state across the country and they don't care. Oh, I do. I get a piece of that property. No, I'll just take the money. They come in and take that piece of cut, force the sale of the whole property, get to buy it at pennies, and then they get to flip it and make a profit off of it. And all those people get like teeny tiny cuts.
Okay, I'll say it straight out. That's not fair.
It's not. And there's actual legal work that's being done to try to rectify just the instability
Mm-hmm.
in that form of ownership. There's someone called Thomas Mitchell who wrote the Uniform Partition of Heir Property Act, and what that was designed to do is to give states a mechanism where people can have more of a say in that. So, for one of the things that it gives people is, all right, let's say somebody comes in and buys that 1%. Now they go to force the sale. Instead of them being able to buy up the whole thing through a forced auction, it gives all of the owners the first right, all of the other
The
heirs,
family
the
members.
first right of
Yeah,
refusal,
first
right?
refusal.
So if there is someone in the pie who has a portion as an heir and they can afford to buy the whole thing, then at least they have first right of refusal.
Right,
Problem is everybody doesn't typically just have money sitting around
right,
to buy a piece of property unexpectedly,
right.
right? Maybe I can do it if I'm given a few years. It doesn't give that piece of, it doesn't give that portion, but people are trying to do it because it is an unstable form of ownership. And more importantly, it has been, when you think about the South and when Black people were freed from enslavement and they bought up property as a form of wealth building,
Right.
these kind of laws have led to the loss of property. I mean, millions and billions of dollars that have been lost. My research has shown that this is also showing up in urban areas. And so when you think about the fact that something like Washington, D.C., which we used to call the chocolate city,
Yeah.
is not really the chocolate
Hmm.
city anymore. And that's because Black home ownership has so dropped in that city because, and my research is looking into how much of that is due to the fact that it was heir property and people weren't prepared to take up the mantle of responsibility in the home ownership such that the wealth could pass down. And that is why it is part of the work I do as an estate planning attorney. Because if you're not legally transferring property, if you're not having the conversations that say, here's a property, it's really valuable, it still has a bit of a mortgage on it. Let's plan how we can pass it down to the people you want to pass it down to, and also give them some other sort of mechanism that helps them to pay for property, like life insurance,
Hmm.
right? So it's an essential part of the work.
It really is. So take me through the steps then. If I'm second generation. Let's just keep it a little simpler.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in great grandfather's home.
Mm-hmm.
I have four cousins.
Mm-hmm.
I figure out all of a sudden, hey, this is an HE. This is an heir property.
Yeah.
And what now? What do I do?
Yeah. Well, the first thing to do is to research in your jurisdiction, like what the laws say about what's required to pass property
And this is
down.
state level.
Yes, it's a
Okay.
state level thing. Generally speaking, you need to pass property down through some sort of a deed, which means someone has to have legal authority to pass the property down, like sign the deed,
Mm,
right? There has to be someone to sign the deed. If the person whose name on the property has passed, then that means you have to go to probate,
mm,
and a probate judge needs to appoint someone to have the legal authority
right.
to then sign the deed and pass the property down.
Right.
If you're now multiple generations away from the last person who died and their name is on the property, then you might have to open a series of probate estates
Wow.
in order to do that. So I don't, I say it to say you want to work with an attorney, because because you want to make sure that when you're doing it and resolving it, it is you've completely cleared the title.
Right.
There's no more issues left. And people tend to say, "Well, this sounds really complicated. It sounds like a lot to do." And I say, "I get it, but the easiest time, the simplest time to fix it is in this generation."
Right.
Because once you go to the next generation, now we're dealing with all the people from your generation on top of the complexity that existed before you. So,
Let me pause here and just say, if you hear something that resonates with you, it's hitting home, you understand you may have an air property issue, please like and subscribe, and share this with your family members, something to start an unaccustomed conversation, because I think it'll really help. Um, so let me come back to the kind of power dynamic, or you find out that this is the case, you say start it now.
mhm.
But beyond that, I know we've talked about values. How do you recommend to people that they start that type of a conversation across across generations, because it may involve 60-year-old cousins and 20-year-old cousins? Or how do they have that conversation? It may involve cousins. You and I have roots in
Mhm.
Jamaica and the West Indies.
Mhm.
You may
Mhm.
be in a different country at that
Yeah.
time.
That's a great question. So I try to think of it as when if air property, I like how you said it, if HE air property is an issue, let's think about what are the causes of that issue, right? We don't want to just deal with, okay, let's just figure out how to get it done. That's true, but there are causes that got us here.
Hmm.
So that's either a breakdown of legal knowledge, right? Legal understanding. It's a breakdown of process. We knew what needed to be done but didn't do it.
Mm,
But also it tends to involve a breakdown of family dynamics.
mm,
And so there's the work that the lawyer can do, but there's the work that can only be done by the family member. And that means that there has to be someone who is willing to have what you call the unaccustomed
right.
conversations to be able to say, "Hey, I talked to a lawyer and they said that this property technically is not owned by any of us," and make it an everybody issue, which means none of us get to benefit from what grandma tried to do. None of us get to benefit from the hard work that great
Mm,
grandpa tried to do. And we know the history of this family. This is not what he or she would want to see us doing. So, can we all get together with the lawyer who can be a neutral party? Because I'm just telling you about the law and what it takes to get there. And then the family kind of deals with the family dynamics of the who will take the lead,
right.
who will be responsible for getting the different parts of the family together. But the lawyer is going to be is going to play an essential role because one, the lawyer can understand with the family tree who's best positioned to sign off on
Okay.
things. The lawyer can say what the process is going to be to explain it to everybody. And the lawyer can best talk about the value that it brings to the family to bring this property back into the family fold to then be used. Because typically, if we're talking about that, that property is more valuable than when great grandma had it. That property is more valuable than when grandpa had it. So it benefits everybody to bring it back into the fold, which can be an encouraging thing for people because I think sometimes people don't understand the value of what it is that they're doing. So it's hard for them to catch on to something. If
Hmm.
you can make something matter to everybody,
Right.
then you can tend to bring people back in.
Wow. No, that's really great advice. Yeah, I think when you think of these types of dynamics and these types of issues, and we talked about values.
Hmm.
So even broaden that when you're talking to people about their estate, whether it's an heir property or whether it's something else, how do what part do values play, and how do generational values?
Values are the anchor. They're they're really it's really hard to talk about legacy when you don't talk about values. And depending on what direction we're talking about, those values can play an even brighter role. So if I'm sitting with someone who's doing estate planning, so they're moving forward, they don't have Heirs property. They're moving forward. They're like, here's all the things that I have. Here are my kids and my family. This is what I'd like to do, right? That values conversation feels more obvious to
Mhm.
that client because they're applying their lived values to their future, right? When we now talk about we're actually looking backwards to fix an issue behind
Mm.
us that puts us in a better footing, then the kind of conversations about the values that I'm having, I'm more weaving them into the conversation as
Mm.
opposed to asking outright.
Right.
Because typically, if a family has to be looking backwards to kind of fix what happens, there are a lot of family dynamics that I don't have
Mm.
privy to, but the one that kind of shows up is grief.
Mhm.
And there's some level of grief that is in the room with
Right.
me. And so the one thing that I can say is a value that I always bring when we have to look backwards and sort of like get something together, try to, salvage what we can is family cohesion.
Mm.
And to say your family dynamic, your family relationships, what your, tell me about the property, right? The person who bought it, tell me about that person. The person who scraped and worked for it,
Mhm.
tell me about why they bought it. Tell me about what it was like to grow up in that house, to be a part of that household. And in listening to those conversations, I can hear values coming through. And those are the values that when now it's my turn to talk and say, here's what we need to do, I'm bringing up what I've heard. I heard that grandpa said, if you can work,
Mhm.
you put your foot to work,
Right,
right?
right.
And so that means that there's some work we need to do right now, and we have the ability to do it right now. So let's get the work done, right? And so that's how I tend to bring it in
Right.
when we have to look backwards to sort of bring everybody forward.
Yeah. So when you're dealing with some of these estate and heirs property issues, is there a difference in um I guess generational reaction, right? I mean, we're in this great wealth transfer that you and I have talked about, where the few that are left in the silent generation, but largely the baby boomers, are
Mhm.
going to be
Mhm.
turning over. And baby
Mhm.
boomers are kind of tight lipped, right? They
Mhm.
built it,
Mhm.
they did it. Then you got those of us who are in the Gen X community, a little more open, but still. And then you got millennials, and then you're even now starting to get some Gen Z folks who
Yep.
are getting responsibilities.
Yep.
So, within these groups, how do you see working with them as being the same or different?
It is different. Um Not different because of the sort of descriptions of each generation, but more it's different depending on how far removed they are from the original purchaser.
Mm.
So, if the original purchaser was a baby boomer, then you have the Gen Xers, then you have the millennials, and you have the Gen Zers. If it was a silent generation, then you have the boomers and right?
Mhm.
Here's what I have found that those closer to the person that was lost, the original owner of the property in that family, it's more emotional. The further you get away, it's more economical
Right.
because there's less of an emotional tie depending on how far back we're going,
Mm.
right? But that doesn't mean that one is good or bad. It's very
Right.
interesting because like the older generation, they were the workers.
Right.
So they were the workers that kept paying the taxes and that kind of stuff. But they were paying the taxes because of the emotional connection to the property. which means that the further we get away from the property, there's going to be less people emotionally tied, which means less willing to just keep paying the taxes for no benefit to themselves.
Right.
So it's less about the generations themselves and more about the fact that the further we get away, the less emotional there is an attachment to the property. And so if I'm talking to people and they're talking about the property down in North Carolina, and that was a property they grew up on, but then they moved up north and they raised their children up north. So now you've got the people who are living up north, their children who were raised by them and they may have moved out west. And then you have the family from North Carolina. So those people who moved up north, they might still be paying the taxes on that
Mm-hmm.
southern property,
Right.
not because they ever intend to go back there, but just because they're holding on to it because they know how hard their parents worked.
Right.
And so there's a for the generations closer to the purchaser, there's a question of what is the practical reason to keep the home, to keep the property, if that's what we're talking about. And then for the later generation, what is a practical benefit of continuing keeping this home for you all as well? So the difference in the conversation is that there's more emotional connection the closer you are to the generation that purchased the property. But ultimately, you have to have the hard conversation about, okay, why?
Why?
What's the why? And as people talk, they should be revealing their own whys,
Mm-hmm.
right? And if it's just an emotional connection, there is no other benefit. They are paying taxes on a property that is not, we're not doing anything to it, then maybe it is time to let it go. But if there is someone in a further away generation who sees some benefit, potential to build on the land, potential to create a house and put it on Airbnb and do all those
Mm-hmm.
kind of things, that creates a space to have that kind of conversation. Now we have an end goal in mind.
Right.
Once we have an end goal, now we move through the process to get there.
So if you have an heir's property, for instance, uh, so when Sheila and I inherited this home that we're taping in from my mom, it was distinct lines, right?
Mm-hmm.
I knew what I had, my brother knew what he had, so we could then move forward. But if you have an heir's property that's been through 2 or 3 generations, and so I guess you actually have 7 or 8 people who are
Mm-hmm.
entitled,
Mm-hmm.
what types of structure gets created for them to be able to make that decision, whether to, and we say inheritance to income, whether to
Mm-hmm.
create an income production out of it, whether it's long term, mid term, or short term rental,
Right.
whether it's even to sell it and disperse. Is what's the structures that we work with?
Structures in terms of legal documents?
Right. What
Okay,
type of
gotcha.
structures start to come
Mhm.
together?
Okay, so once we have in the family sort of figured out who's the decision maker, right? Who gets legal authority to take action, and we talk about the process to get through. This is why we then move people into why it's so important to do estate planning, right? This is when we start. One of the first things I actually ask when we're doing the process is, does everybody have powers of attorney?
Mm,
And the reason why I ask that is because let's say we designate someone as a decision maker and something happens to that decision maker, we need to have backups in place. So I make sure if we're going to go through this process, the process may take some time. Everybody needs powers of attorney because if someone needs to step up for you, we need to make sure that doesn't pause the process that we're trying to move through. We also need to make sure that everybody has a will, right? Because if something happens to you, without you having designated what happens to your property that you're entitled to, your estate adds to the complexity that we're already dealing with here. So it gives the motivation for everybody in the room to do what we call like to do the foundation of estate planning, right? Your powers of attorney, your will. Everybody should have that. I don't care what age you are. If you are over the age of 18, if you are making decisions for yourself, if you're earning side income, main income, a little bit of reported income. That's none of my business. The point is that you should have your powers of attorney in your will,
right.
right? And so those are the mechanisms then. And depending on what the family decides to do, we might create a family trust, right, of some sort that says, now we do want this to become income producing. We want this to benefit different generations. Now we put it in a trust. We actually protect it. We talk about what decision making looks like going forward.
Right. Yeah. Um, So then, let me ask this question. Let's see how I would phrase it. My son, you said anybody over 18. I think you
Anybody
said.
over 18.
So how do then we talk to people who are 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 24? How do you, I mean, when we start talking about estate with them, I know I've had conversations with my children, and you early on when I'd bring up estate equal death, and they don't want to talk
Yeah.
about death, right? But I often say inheritance and estate is for the living, not the dead. So what are some ways that you would recommend that you have those conversations? Or it can be the other way around too. The young person wants to talk about it and the elder doesn't.
Okay. First things first is to reframe what estate means. Estate means preparation. It doesn't mean death. It means preparation. Because everything we do in estate planning is not actually about death.
Mm.
So we have to sort of reframe for people that it is about preparation for you to live the fullest life that you can without a concern about these things that I know you worry about. You just put the worry back there. Oh, something might
Mm.
happen. Just throw it back there because if I don't think about it, it doesn't exist. And that is just not how real life works. So the first thing is to sort of reframe. We are planning, meaning we are being prepared so that you can focus on living your best life. That's where your focus is. The second thing is whoever is the person who wants to do the talking should be the first one to do their estate planning.
Mm.
Because if you're just telling someone else to do something that you haven't done and everyone's above the age of 18, then we are not speaking from a place of authenticity, right? We are saying, you should do this, but I shouldn't do this. And I don't call people names, but typically, if someone is saying, you should do this thing, I don't need to do it, but we both should be doing it. Typically, that means that we're not being consistent in applying standards, right? So you want to do your estate planning first because then you are in the best position to talk about the value of it, like just as a regular person, to talk about the fact that you did it because you love somebody and somebody loves you, to talk about the fact that you did it because you are planning for greater. And so you want to be prepared for greater.
Right.
You did it because it kind of gives you had the kind of conversations where you know where you're going, which means now you're just working on the path to get there, right? But if in particular you're talking about it with, your 18 to 30-year olds, I wouldn't start with the will. I would start with the power of attorney because that is about autonomy and decision making. And given that we both have children, I think the first thing that we know from the age, I mean, starting at age 2, autonomy is the most
Autonomy
important
is the
thing
thing.
to our
Is the
kids,
thing.
right?
So
So you talk about it in terms of autonomy, right? Do you want to be prepared to be in control of decisions made as it relates to you, your decisions, and your body? If so, then let's put these things in place, which either means that me and mom step in on your behalf if that's what you want, or someone that you trust, a trusted aunt, a deep trusted personal friend, right? And to not try to impose that decision upon our kids, but to really say, I am empowering you with the ability to really walk in whatever is your desire for your life to look like. I'm giving you what that's going to look like. And so I encourage parents that the first estate plan should be paid for by you.
mm,
And so you give if your kids are in that 18 to 30, you get them a basic is not the right word, but like a foundational, like essential documents as a part of estate planning. And you do that for them.
um, there are a couple of more questions. I could ask you 100 more questions, but there are a couple more questions I really specifically wanted to ask you. We've had some conversations before, and I've heard you talk about it. You were part of the Legacy Bridge Roundtable first one, but I've also heard you say something about builders and bridges,
Yes.
which I think I really love, and I think it's really important. So tell me that, reframe that so people really understand what you're talking about.
I think the responsibility that each of us is given is to take what we have and do the best we can with it, right? So if what you were given was education but not finances, do the best you can with education. See if you can make it somewhere on the financial side. If you were given privilege but maybe not as much education, although privilege tends to come with education,
Right.
right? But whatever you were given, let that always be your starting point, right? And build from there, right? So if you were given a house, then do your best with that house and then flip it to your forever home, right? Or take what you have with that house and use it to buy a home that you rent out. Whatever you've been given, build from there because that's what we talk about. When we talk about legacy, it means there is something that we have built
Hmm.
to be able to pass on. But then when we talk about passing on, think about what that bridge looks like, right? Don't just build the thing, build the bridge. What if every city had buildings in it, but no roads to
No
connect them,
bridges. Right.
right? If we build it, but we don't connect it, then it's not working the way we really want it to work. So when we think about our family ecosystems, our community ecosystems, it is essential to build,
Mm.
but it is incomplete to only build. You must build and connect, meaning build and bridge,
Yeah.
right? So for us as individuals, that means when we build as parents, we're always building with our kids in mind.
Hmm.
So if I'm building with my kids in mind, but I don't bridge it so my kids understand what I'm building and how to get to what I'm building, then I've created a hole.
Yeah.
There's a pothole they can't go around.
Right.
Right. And so now instead of just driving along the road to what I built, they're stopping on the road to figure out how to fill in the potholes. So they can drive over it. Right. So you can't just build, you got to build and bridge. And so that is sort of my ethos when it comes to the work that I do because I meet builders or I meet people with tools to build.
Right.
And my job is to help them to build
Bridge.
and to bridge it.
Build and bridge. I
Build and
love it.
bridge.
I love that. So, okay, final question. Um, you're a young lady, I can say that.
Hmm.
But what's your legacy gonna be?
Oh, you couldn't give me that before the show started. Let me think.
And I mean, I know it, and it changes over time. I'll
It
say that from my
does.
perspective.
It
But for
does.
right now, where you're sitting and you're trying to think about your legacy, what what what's your legacy gonna be? What's part of it gonna be?
An essential part of my legacy is my willingness to look beyond what is to what could be
Mm.
and to work towards what could be, right? To not be, to teach myself,
Teach.
um, my students, my clients, my kids, my community, to teach those who come into contact with me that if you learn nothing else from me, that you understand that I wasn't limited by the circumstances
Mm.
around me. I saw beyond them because I believed beyond them. And
Mm.
so whatever God has for you, right? I can't decide what that is for you, but I can encourage you that if your circumstances are the complete definition of your life,
Mm.
then you're missing your opportunity to build legacy.
Right.
So I don't know what all of it is going to be, but what I
That's a
do
great
know
piece.
is that it's going to be beyond my current circumstances.
That's a great piece. Okay, so where can people find you?
People can find me at thelegacycounselor.com. Try to keep that simple. If you want to work with me, thelegacycounselor.com is the best way to find me. I technically have an Instagram page for the Legacy Counselor. I promise to check it more. Um, but yeah, the best way to find me is through thelegacycounselor.com. I am on LinkedIn as well, Shakisha Morgan, um, Shakisha Esquire at gmail.com. So those are, I'll give you all the
Yeah, we'll make
information so
sure
you can
people have
provide
them.
it. But I find me wherever people are talking about boldness and legacy and buildings and bridges.
Great.
I'll be there.
Well, thank you for joining us on Inheritance to Income. Thank you for what you do
Thank you for having
as a
me.
teacher and as a planner and all of the things that are involved in that. And so, um, i- if these things really hit home, if something you didn't understand, reach out to us at Inheritance to Income, reach out to the legacy counselor, because education is the key to building for generations, not just for today. We want you to design your legacy, not let it be by default. We want inheritance to come with instructions, and we want you to be able to create generation after generation impact that grows. And so, again, thank you for the time you've granted us. God bless.